Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Leibniz's Theodicy. Now before we get into that, Leibniz is a fascinating figure in the history of philosophy. You might already know Leibniz's name, as Leibniz is one of the discoverers of calculus alongside Isaac Newton, and they actually got into a very bitter and protracted conflict about who discovered calculus first at the end part of Leibniz's life. Needless to say, Leibniz was one really smart cookie. He obviously was at the forefront of developments within mathematics. He did things like engineer an early calculator. He was just preeminently smart, interesting guy. And one of the ways that he was really smart and really interesting is as a philosopher. Leibniz, like Spinoza and Descartes before him, developed his own fully fledged metaphysical system of philosophy. And in fact, in many ways, Leibniz's system of philosophy is more bizarre and more sci-fi, and it's just straight up weird, really, than what we find in either Descartes or Spinoza. That's all the more interesting and strange because Leibniz sees himself as defending, basically, orthodox Christianity. Leibniz was trying to discover the set of metaphysical commitments that all believers, regardless of their denomination, could agree with. And he was going to use reason as his central way of getting there. Leibniz only published one book during his lifetime, the Theodicy, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. This book is an extended response to Pierre Bayle's Manichaeans chapter in the Historical Critical Dictionary that we talked about last time. So Leibniz sees himself as sort of the defender of both Enlightenment and the Christian faith, seeking to respond to the criticisms of Pierre Bayle and the problem of evil. You'll recall that Bayle concluded that there was an unbridgeable gap between the Christian religion and Enlightenment philosophy. Christian faith demands obedience, and Enlightenment faith wants to interrogate the reason behind everything, and so these are necessarily antithetical forces on Bayle's account. Now, if Leibniz is going to be the defender of both the Christian faith and Enlightenment philosophy, he has to show that there is a harmony between these two demands of our life. Leibniz believes that there is genuine reason for adopting Christian faith, that Christian theology and moral principles say something that is importantly, robustly true about the world, and that you really have to go through the process of rationally explicating those beliefs and tenets. And Leibniz certainly did that quite a lot himself. Leibniz is often known as the philosopher of harmony, in particular pre-established harmony, an idea that we're going to discuss in more detail in videos in the weeks to come. But in general, he was Irenic. In other words, he was meaning to sort of bring various denominations of Christian believers together under a common system or framework. And he wanted to do that with the believers in modernity and the Enlightenment and the believers in the Christian religion. And so his system, his metaphysical system, is set up to satisfy both of these demands. Now, that amounts to showing that God is good, right? In other words, Leibniz is not just going to argue in the way that Descartes and Spinoza did to show that, for example, God necessarily exists or something like that, or that the belief in God is rationally mandatory or something. He accuses them of treating God like a despot, right? Treating God like this, absolute power that you have to acquiesce to, right? But it doesn't offer a normative appraisal of God. In other words, they don't get so far as being able to judge that God is actually good. Now, we're going to see more detail in the following weeks that Leibniz thinks that this is related to a deep metaphysical mistake in their philosophies, in particular, a metaphysical mistake regarding the nature of modality. So there are deeper philosophical reasons for why Leibniz thinks that Spinoza, Leibniz, Hobbes, and the tradition of early modern philosophy sort of treat God as this overwhelming power, but tend to de-emphasize the degree to which God is benevolent and good, and that's because everyone is living in a very troubled time in European history. It's hard to look out at the historical events of the 30 Years' War, for example, and say that world is good, right? That's a rationally satisfying world, that's a world that makes sense and is justified. And so that's really the central problem, and for this reason, Bayle comes to occupy a special place in Leibniz's philosophy, because Bayle comes to represent that sort of lament of modernity, right? He represents the weariness of the modern Christian believer, who on the one hand is sort of forced to believe that God is good, but is unable to ever make sense of that insight, right? It's just imposed onto them, right? Leibniz thinks that this is incompatible with a genuine love of God, right? If you actually love God and don't simply fear God, then you have to appraise God and God's actions as rationally satisfactory, right? So you have to show that God is good. That means both rationally satisfying in the sense that a priori arguments attest to both the coherence of the idea of God and its necessity, but also worthy of the highest approval in worship, right? This normative moral appraisal of God is what is conspicuously absent in both the philosophies of Descartes and Spinoza. So as we mentioned, the Theodicy tackles what we could call Bayle's problem, which is, how is it conceivable that a perfect God willed to create our very imperfect world, right? How is it possible to hold those two beliefs together? Bayle thinks the problem is so intractable that he's willing to give up on the whole enterprise of rationality, right? This is the problem, the arch problem that all Enlightenment philosophers will have to deal with in one way or another. And for Leibniz believes that this is a problem that is very well taken and urgent, because on Leibniz's view, the world is contingent, which means that God could have made it otherwise than it is. Notice that this is the exact opposite of what we saw in Spinoza, who held that everything that happened in the world was absolutely necessary, right? So Leibniz is going to avoid explanations of the nature of evil that want to say that evil is necessary because God had to create evil, or something along those lines. He has to take on the harder claim of explaining why it's rationally satisfactory that God created the world, even with all of the evils and so on that are a part of it. So Bale's challenge to the Orthodox Christian believer constantly, for example, is, we know, for example, of cases where extreme forms of violence and evil are inflicted on young children, right? Why didn't God create the same world but without that event, right? Why did that particular event that seems so gratuitous and unnecessary and contingent have to be that way? Now, Leibniz's solution, which we're going to have to develop over the course of several weeks, so we're not really going to get to fully satisfying defense of this account quite in this video, but hopefully we will, as the overall effect of our videos in the next couple of weeks, is Leibniz is going to claim that we live in the best of all possible worlds. So in other words, there are many possible worlds that could have been realized. That goes along with saying that our world is contingent, is that it could have been otherwise, but that the world that we are in is actually the best one, even with all of its evil in there. Notice that Leibniz, from the way that he set up the problem, basically has to say this, right? If God is worthy of the highest approval and worship, well, the best thing that he could possibly do is create the best world, right? And so Leibniz's task is to show that that best world that God could create is in fact the one that we actually are living in. And so rather than argue that God's decision to create our world as it is and so on is necessary for various kinds of strange metaphysical reasons, to the contrary, Leibniz will defend the view that God's decision is actually good, right? In other words, that we should approve of God's decision to create our world, even with the extreme forms of evil that we just discussed. And in essence, Leibniz's answer comes down to this, that a world that exhibits every degree of perfection is better than one that is absolutely perfect. So an absolutely perfect world, on Leibniz's conception, would just be God hanging out by themselves. Right? No finite thing has entered into existence. The only thing that exists is what absolutely must exist and exists in any possible world, namely God, right? Leibniz is going to claim that our world is better than that world, and our world is better than competing options, other possible worlds, right? Why is our world better than that world? Well, his central idea is that evils are reflections of degrees of perfection, right? So, someone that does a horribly immoral act, right, they have an extremely low degree of perfection, right? So the world in which they exist is better than the world in which they don't exist, on Leibniz's view. Now, you might wonder, okay, that's well and good, right? But why isn't it the case that God can just pick out the worst actions in human history and make those not exist, but make all those other finite things continue to exist? Wouldn't that be better, right? And Leibniz answers this question by claiming that God has no particular volitions. Here's what he means by this. Everything that happens in the world, according to early modern philosophy, are all causally related. It's not possible to interject into the middle of a causal sequence and make one and only one event different than it otherwise might have been while keeping the rest of the causal series the same. That's just not how causality works on the early modern account of it. And so God actually can't go through and change little individual events. God can only choose to realize the entire causal nexus of a world, right? So when someone murders a child, does something horribly immoral like that nature, it's not that God specifically approves of that action, but that God approves of the world in which there are human beings with their imperfections, right? To a world that is just God and God alone. So God himself isn't the cause of the evil, right? It belonged to the nature of the world that it had to be evil to some degree. And God only brings about the maximally perfect world, right? And it just so happens on Leibniz's account that the maximally perfect world includes some events that we would rather it didn't, right? Now, that sounds very much like early modern metaphysics. We're getting the kind of enlightenment, rationally satisfactory part. What about the religious part? Well, Leibniz thinks that this insight is the basic idea behind the theological notion of Jesus Christ, right? That Jesus Christ, for example, is God choosing in an act of infinite mercy to manifest himself as a particular human being, to sacrifice his only begotten Son to forgive the sins of mankind, right? In other words, the world where human beings sin, and there are particular people with all of their inadequacies, through the figure of Jesus Christ, is raised to be better than a world where only God existed, right? God in his infinite mercy, that is a recognition of the greater perfection of finite things, right? Versus an infinite void in which God and only God exists, right? So, Leibniz's solution is rationally satisfying. It draws on this notion of causality that, as we've seen, is really central to the development of early modern philosophy. And we're going to investigate in a lot more detail in the following weeks, like what makes a world, for example, right? But it also is able to vindicate even some of the most esoteric of truths of the Christian religion. Now, one important thing to close about the Theodicy that's important is that the Theodicy, while being the only book that Leibniz published over the course of his lifetime, is really a popular book. He's writing it for a general European audience. He's not writing strictly to philosophers. In other words, Leibniz's Theodicy is not really like an equivalent of Spinoza's Ethics. Leibniz here hasn't developed his metaphysical system from the foundations up, as it were, right? And so this is just one way of presenting his overall worldview. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to dig a lot deeper into Leibniz's picture to explain how this general response to the problem of evil that we outlined in just a few minutes is really rationally satisfying, and it can figure into a philosophical system that can rival those of Descartes and Spinoza. Needless to say, I love Leibniz, and I'm very, very interested in hearing what you think of his philosophy over the next coming weeks.